marooned in the the water-free part of it.
Well, if you need any water, I'll pass it down.
This one's mine.
I mean, we could just get started unless anyone wants to. Cool. The thing I just said at the start, by the way, is someone has left their phone somewhere. So if you suddenly don't have a phone, Vincent at the back can give it to you.
You can't ring it.
Yeah. Cool. But no, thank you so much for joining us on this first day of the return from the holidays, but which feels very much like the start of the summer rather than the end of it. I'm really thrilled to be having this discussion because it ties in to some of the most important things in our politics and economics. I think we've been working. One of the reasons we wanted to do this is we've been working at the Centre for Policy Studies on a collection of essays about generational imbalances within society. Which I think Tom may mention some of that work, and it is sort of genuinely terrifying when you start looking, projecting things down the track. And the IFS recently put out a piece of work showing what will happen to spending over the next 50 years, which is has it sort of nicely manipulated the scales to have it going up at a 45-degree angle. And of course, the OBR fiscal risks report has pinpointed all manner of horrors lurking in our future. So we will try not to be too depressed. Between the brilliant minds on this panel, we will come up with many wonderful ideas for how to pull Britain back from the brink and put us on a secure long-term foundation. And we have a brilliant panel to do that. Tom Clockerty, Head of Tax and Research, Research Director and Head of Tax at the Centre for Policy Studies. Richard Hughes, who of course runs the Office for Budget Responsibility and is one of the man who haunts Jeremy Hunt's nightmares. Soothing chat from the Telegraph, and Dr. Gerald Lyons, again one of our most eminent economic commentators. We've asked everyone to just talk for a very brief amount of time so that we can have more discussion and more questions from the audience. But given, Richard, it was your report which sort of started the conversation going about this event, perhaps we should start with you. What is the long-term outlook for the UK finances, and what are the main sort of pinch points that fracture points, I suppose, would be a better way of putting it,
sure,
that you see?
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for coming here today. As Rob was saying, we're sort of best known for producing the forecasts that underpin the government's biannual budgets and autumn statements. But what we also do once a summer is produce this report, which is called Fiscal Risks and Sustainability, and it looks beyond just the sort of 5-year horizon of the standard budget to look 50 years ahead at what is the long-term outlook for the public finances. And it usually doesn't get as much attention as our medium-term budget forecasts. But I think this one got more attention than usual when it came out back in July. And I think that's partly because our debt to GDP ratio, which is the sort of key metric we use to assess, one of the key metrics we use to assess the sustainability of our public finances, passed a sort of totemic Rubicon of 100% of GDP in the recent past. And as we look out to the long term, that debt trajectory continues to rise for a whole host of reasons if government leaves policy unchanged up to around 300% of GDP. So that is the sort of scale of the challenge. I think it also got more immediate attention than usual because our forecasts always kind of show that debt is rising over the long term because interest rates have started to rise in the past year. So that high level of debt is not just posing a potential burden to future generations, but it's posing an increasing burden on existing generations because the cost of that debt is rising, and it's rising very quickly. I think there are still some who say, well, look, it's nothing to worry about. And they either say, well, look, lots of other countries have 100% debt to GDP ratios. Japan's got one which is above 200% on some measure. So why are we particularly worried at 100? Others point out that, well, we've had 100% of debt to GDP ratio in the past, in the 1960s. You know, we're still here. Kind of what is the concern about having debt at that level? And I think that I would say there are two reasons to still worry despite those facts. And one is, if you look at the comparison between us and other countries in the world that now also have debt at around 100% of GDP, and those include France, they include the US, much more of our debt is short-term than in these other countries. We used to have an average maturity of debt of around 7 years. We now have an effective maturity of our debt of around 2 years. And that just means that higher interest rates hit our debt burden much more quickly. So we feel the pain of having high debt and rising interest rates much more quickly than we might have done in the past. And that means you've got less time to adjust to those rising interest rates than you might have thought. A second reason is that I think one reason why people can be complacent about the level of debt is that they say, well, look, inflation's also high, and that will just inflate away the level of debt. That used to be true about 30 or 40 years ago. It is no longer true. And that is because around a quarter of our debt stock is actually directly inflation linked. So the stock of that debt goes up with inflation. It doesn't get eroded by inflation. And that's the highest stock of inflation-linked debt anywhere in the G7. The second highest is in Italy, who's got about 12%. So a lot more of our debt is directly linked to inflation and is not going to be eroded by rising inflation the way it is in other countries. And a third reason to be concerned is that more and more of our debt is in foreign hands, which just means that it is more vulnerable to shifting sentiment amongst the people that hold it. It used to be that around 13% of our debt was in foreign hands. It's now reached about 25%. That's the second highest proportion in the G7 and continuing to rise. So I think there are reasons to worry about our particular debt position, even compared to other advanced economies who've got high debt burdens. And I think there are also reasons to worry about how our current level of debt compares to the last time we had 100% debt to GDP ratio, because the dynamics going forward are very different from the dynamics we faced in the 1960s. Back in the 1960s, which was the last time we had 100% debt to GDP ratio, the baby boomers were just entering the labor force. More and more women were also entering the labor force. That was growing our tax base relative to the people who were acting as a drain on the public finances through the welfare state, National Health Service. Defense spending was falling from 10% of GDP at the end of the Korean War down to 2% of GDP at the end of the Cold War. At the very least, that peace dividend is no longer being generated year on year from falling defense spending, and lots of reasons to believe that all the pressures on defense spending are on the upside. We were in the midst of a post-war productivity boom in the 1960s. Productivity growth has actually been very, very disappointing in the last decade. And we also had a closed capital account, which meant that we could keep interest rates artificially low relative to the rate of growth and keep that debt affordable, even if markets would have wanted more. So, and looking ahead, those things that were going in our favor in the 1960s and helping to bring the debt to GDP ratio down are now going against us. We've got an aging society, we've got a less secure world, we've got rising interest rates, and we also have new challenges, things like climate change, which we know could pose significant additional burdens on the public finances that we weren't facing back during that period. So just leaving policy on autopilot is very unlikely to solve our debt sustainability problems, and there are reasons to worry that on top of that, there are additional risks that we might face on top of that higher burden.
Thank you very much. Gerard, would you concur with that? Or?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, I concur with much of that. Maybe if I can make 3 points. One, in relation to Richard's comments. Second, about one of the current phases that we're going through about public sector balance sheets, and also the important third about fiscal policy still has an important role. But if we take the first point, avoiding a debt trap is a key challenge, not just for Britain, but as Richard's touched on, for most of the G7. Indeed, the International Monetary Fund back in March in their fiscal monitor concurred with much of what Richard said about debt to GDP ratios being around 100% or slightly above in most of the G7 in coming years. A country is in the debt trap if your debt is more than 100% of GDP, and second, if your rate of interest you're paying is higher than your rate of economic growth. Now, of course, nominal GDP growth is important, it's not the solution, and nominal GDP growth will allow some of the debt to GDP ratio to fall, hopefully in coming years. But the reality is that economic growth is going to remain weak, and in all likelihood, normalisation of monetary policy will result in interest rates remaining much higher than in the recent past. So when it comes to options for the government, they're quite limited. You can grow, you can borrow, you can have austerity, you can have tax increases, or you can have reform. Our borrowing ability is starting to be constrained. Bear in mind, regulations encourage banks to really do two things: lend to the property sector or to buy government debt. So the regulatory environment is slightly geared to encouraging banks to buy government debt. And also, as we've seen, and as Richard touched on, central banks, including our own, have started to buy more and more government debt in recent years, quantitative easing being the reason why the vulnerability of our debt to interest rates is now much higher than it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So borrowing, you don't have much room for manoeuvre, so you need to keep the markets on side. Austerity didn't work last time, 10 years ago, and one has to question that at the moment. Tax increases, taxes are at their highest level since the Second World War, and then reform is always talked about but never really instigated. The autopilot that Richard touched on can also be applied to the current economic consensus thinking, which is that UK growth is weak, therefore more of the budget deficit is structural, not cyclical. Spending is hard to squeeze, therefore taxes have to keep rising. But something has to give, and therefore I do think that we need to actually re-examine basically where the levers are. But at the moment, it comes down to the issue about can you get growth? And growth is seen as the solution, but no one really has the answer to that. That leads on to the second point, which is can we start to use fiscal policy to actually try and address some of those economic challenges to encourage economic growth? The UK's inherent problems, which predate Brexit, go back 40, 50 years, which is low savings and in particular low investment. Now you at the CPS have done some excellent work in terms of changing tax policy to encourage investment, namely through allowances and through lower corporate tax rates. I would encourage that. But one of the big fads at the moment in economics is about public sector net wealth, and whether by looking at the balance sheet of the public sector, we can find a solution to this underlying problem. I'm quite positive about the idea of looking at public sector balance sheets, but my fear is that people might see them as the panacea rather than a way to readdress or focus our attention. Basically, the idea is that we currently look at debts and liabilities for an obvious reason: the government has to fund itself. But often if the government spends, if it spends in terms of investment, it can build up an asset. Of course, not all of those assets can be sold. Obviously, you go down Whitehall, you can see public sector assets that have been sold in recent years and converted into hotels. But roads in Scotland, roads in Kent can't be sold. So one needs to be realistic that while public sector net wealth will allow a government to start to look at the asset side, it still doesn't get you away from the problem. You need to fund your liabilities. The positive thing about public sector net wealth is that when you look at the assets, 3/4 of the country's liabilities are offset by assets. So public sector net wealth is about £600 billion. The national debt is about 2.5 trillion. Now, the challenge is that some people might use this as an option or an excuse to just increase public spending on the basis it creates an asset. And that's the challenge. Of course, some fiscal conservatives do say the great thing about a balance sheet is that you can start to include liabilities such as unfunded future pension liabilities or other liabilities such on public-private finance initiatives. What I would say the positive about a balance sheet is that it should allow you to start to focus strategically on where the government spends its money. Remember Peter Lilly, when he was a minister a quarter of a century ago, said the easiest thing to cut is public investment because roads don't vote. And that's the challenge. We need to recognise that public spending is now over £1 trillion. The trajectory, as Richard's touched on in his report, is for it to keep on rising with an ageing population and as health spending as well as education spending absorb a greater amount of spending for obvious reasons in coming years. But a balance sheet is an interesting way of looking at this issue, but not as an excuse to have ever more public spending, but as a way to actually start to strategically focus on where the government does spend its money. And the third point, if I may, is notwithstanding our concerns about the level of debt, about a debt trap, and about where the government spends its money, it's also important to stress that fiscal policy does play a very important role in macroeconomic stabilisation, and we shouldn't forget that. But obviously that needs to be within the context of having a credible fiscal plan that keeps the markets on side. Since 2008, the markets, as well as economies, have become used to cheap money. Monetary policy has always been the shock absorber. The pandemic did allow the government to increase its public spending, but now with monetary policy normalisation and implicitly with interest rates being higher and yields being higher, that not only constrains you in terms of the debt to GDP, But we need to focus on the fact that if monetary policy doesn't have that ability to be the shock absorber, then it's important to recognise that that role might increasingly fall on fiscal policy, which is a dilemma. Of course, fiscal policy changes to help the supply side, whether it's on national insurance, labour market, or in Ireland, corporation tax to encourage investment should be encouraged. But often I find in the UK, and it's a concluding point, is that the politicians always allow it to be focused about headline tax rates. And that should not be where the debate is, but unfortunately that's where the narrative often is. So bring it all together, yeah, I think we have a challenge. We need to avoid the debt trap. Looking at the balance sheet, I think, is a really positive thing, but it shouldn't be an excuse to spend more. It should be a way to encourage a focus on where we do spend our money. And third, notwithstanding all of this, in an era where monetary policy is being normalised and interest rates will settle at a higher level, we have to still recognise that despite all the challenges with public finances, fiscal policy has a role to play in macroeconomic stabilisation, and that adds to the dilemma.
One statistic, if people haven't been reading my Sunday Times columns for some reason, is that I mean, Richard will have a more up-to-date figure on this, but as of the March budget, the bill for the debt interest bill, just the interest on the debt, was set to be north of 100 billion, which would make it the second biggest department in Whitehall. Which is sort of quite an extraordinary. I mean, that's literally doubled in a year, and I mean, obviously rates might not remain this high, but as Richard and Co were saying, like this is borrowing costs money. Is that, and that's something we're having to come to terms with. But Sue, sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat anything that the others have said on the panel, but I guess both of you used the word autopilot, and on the way here, as I was walking, I was thinking about the jobs market. And back, I don't know, about a decade ago when Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of England, I remember he used something called forward guidance to suggest that interest rates would not rise until unemployment, which was, I think, in the high 7% at the time, until it fell to 7%. And there was this idea that unemployment would stay high for several years. But I think I see Charles Goodhart there. But in a sort of Goodhart-esque fashion, it quickly fell to 5%. And there's this idea that the UK economy has been a jobs-creating machine for much of the last decade, and it's consistently surprised people like me who've been writing about the economy since the financial crisis. And there were always headlines about record employment, etc. We haven't had wage growth, but I guess that's another story. But the pandemic changed all that, and obviously the workforce has shrunk, more than other major economies. This sort of big engine the UK could rely on is no longer there, and part of it, as Richard suggested, that those baby boomers, I mean, the last of the baby boomer generation, born in '64, they turn 60 next year, and those people, a lot of them, during the pandemic, perhaps decided, I've had enough of this. The person that bought my house was actually in this category. They decided to sell their house and move to Bognor Regis, and they're not providing their services. They're not in the labour market anymore, and that is a problem for the UK. And I think the Institute for Employment Studies suggests that employment growth will halve over the next decade, and that has implications for growth, number one, obviously for jobs, for inflation, and it will touch on all different parts of the economy. And I guess, the other thing that I was thinking of in that sort of green book on Richard's lap, at the back of that book is a chart that shows the number of people aged over 65. I think the share at the moment is something like 18%, and that's set to grow to about 27% in 50 years' time, when I will be an octogenarian and very much part of that growing group. And for people like me, I guess I'm thinking, will there be enough money to pay for my state pension and a comfortable retirement that perhaps people are enjoying today? That's it.
Well, and that leads nicely into what I'm going to talk about, actually. It's always nice to go last on such a well-informed panel, but I just want to make 4 quick points, really, and my focus is is less about the debt and more about the spending pressures that are going to lead to that debt over the long term. So point number 1 is that the fiscal impact of an ageing population is a massive problem, and it's a problem that our short-termist political system seems completely incapable of addressing and dealing with. It's not exactly a secret. The OBR publishes figures on it every summer. Even before the OBR was around, I can remember people writing about this, talking about it. But to give you a sense of the scale, I think the latest book there suggests that spending on the over 65s will increase by 11 percentage points of GDP over the next 50 years. In today's terms, that's more than 250 billion a year that we're going to have to find to pay for social care, for pensions and pensioner benefits, and for healthcare for the elderly. That's not an easy amount of money to rustle up. It's roughly what we get from the entirety of the income tax system at the moment. So that's a problem. And it's a problem that actually our political class has done nothing to make better and a great deal to make worse over the last 10 years or more. So point number 2, if we had to fill that fiscal gap with tax increases, it's going to be extremely painful. And not just painful for the rich and not just painful for big businesses or non-doms or people receiving inheritances or any of that. You could do the full Corbyn agenda and then some, and you might get a fifth of the way to filling the gap that you're facing. If you're wanting to raise north of 250 billion in today's terms, that is going to need massive increases in income tax, in VAT, realistically, and increases on the scale that would cost ordinary households £7,000, £8,000, £9,000 per year. Money they don't have. So we're talking, and of course, these things are so awful as to be impossible, and you think they can't possibly happen. But if they did, you'd be talking about a catastrophic fall in living standards. Point number 3, avoiding those dire outcomes, I think requires 2 things. First of all, absolutely prioritising economic growth over everything else. And plenty of people have suggested that before. Some people have...
a year ago, I think.
Well, right, exactly. People have worn the clothes, they've used the rhetoric. But even then, actually, I'm not sure if you look at the policies that were being proposed, they're anything close to what genuinely prioritising economic growth over everything else would look like. So that's the first half. But the other thing is I think we're going to have radical reform of the post-war welfare state over the next 50 years. The kind of stuff which is so far beyond the realm of existing political possibility that people would be embarrassed to talk about it in public for the most part. But there is, I think, a big difference between proposing changes you want to make in this parliament or putting something in a manifesto and saying this whole system is going to have to look radically different in 50 years' time than it does today, otherwise it's going to bankrupt us. But I think that's where we are. And one final point, the ageing population and its fiscal impact is a huge economic problem, yes, but it's also increasingly a political problem because we're very close to the point where a majority of voters in a majority of constituencies are over the age of 55. And if you're talking about prioritising growth, that may upset people who maybe have their most productive years behind them, who have a sort of status quo bias and so on. That's just how it is. Older societies tend to be, I guess, less dynamic, less innovative and everything. But equally, if you were talking about significantly changing the benefits that age group receives from the state, they might not want to vote for it. And so there's a real political economy problem here. And so, I started off by saying our short-term political system is incapable of dealing with these issues. And the fact is I completely understand why, but it doesn't change the facts or the projections, which I, for one, find rather scary. I'm an optimist. That's a horribly pessimistic way to end my remarks, but hopefully we can say some sunnier stuff in the questions and discussion.
Well, yeah, sunnier, yeah. So actually, I wanted to sort of build on that then in the first question. So I remember when I started out in Fleet Street, I was working at the Telegraph, and the Cameron government, when the Cameron government came in, Jeremy, then colleague Jeremy Warner pointed out that essentially all of its spending was on the past, not the future. The stuff which was slashed was, as you know, it was the roads don't vote problem. All of the the NHS was protected, elderly benefits were protected, but investment was slashed. And if you look at the last 10 years, you see a consistent pattern of essentially investment and young people and working people losing out to elderly people. I point this out and get abused for it quite often, but the triple lock goes up and up and up. The help to buy ISA for young people doesn't go up and up and up. It doesn't, it just loses its value with inflation. Same for NI, same for income tax, same for all kinds of measures. And obviously that doesn't happen because our politicians are sinister and evil. It happens because old people vote in massive numbers and people don't want to lose elections. I mean, I remember when the latest announcement about the triple lock was made, I sort of despairingly spoke to someone who said, someone who's involved, I said, that's the worst decision you could have made. And he was like, yes. And it got the biggest cheers in House of Parliament because MPs know which side their bread is buttered. So what I want to ask the panel more broadly is, I think Gerard summed up pretty well the options of how you can fix this. I mean, which of those options are like realistic or going to happen, or is it, as Tom suggested, time to end the disastrous democratic experiment?
I don't think I suggested that.
Richard, if you want to go first, or
Yeah, so I suppose maybe focusing on this question around growth and productivity, because obviously there are decisions you can make about tax and spending, but those are sort of inherently political decisions and ones where people need to make choices about how big a state they want and how they want to pay for it. Obviously, if you can get more growth, then that makes all of those decisions easier. And I think one of the reasons why the last decade or so has felt so difficult politically has been the fact that the economy has not just been generating lots of additional resources to spread around. And when you look at the outlook for growth, the way we look at it, and basically what we call the sort of supply side or potential output of the economy, you can basically break it down into three components. One is the workforce. The second is investment, which is the stuff people have to work with when they're working. And then the third is productivity, so the productivity with which you're combining labor and capital. As Sue was saying, there's probably still some way to go on getting more workforce out of UK society, but we've already come an awfully long way in terms of getting people into the workforce and keeping them there. There is still a bit of greenfield, some of which the Chancellor took advantage of in his last budget in trying to extend childcare support down to parents of children under the age of 3. So getting more young parents into the workforce is one way of getting people sort of earlier on in their lives into the workforce, working earlier, staying in the workforce, so you can get a bit more workforce, a bit more employment growth out of an economy which has already experienced quite an employment miracle. The challenges, the people that you've got left are the people who are long-term sick, consider themselves disabled, increasingly on disabled benefits, or older workers. And one of the challenges we've already raised the pension age a lot, and one of the challenges of getting more older workers into the workforce is, while life expectancy seems to be extending, it's not healthy life expectancy. It's basically more years spent in ill health. And so expecting those people to spend a lot more time in the workforce means they're essentially cutting into what might be the healthy years of their retirement. But possibly some ground still to seize on the workforce side if you want to get some more growth in future. On investment, there are things that governments can do to encourage investment. We've had things like the super deduction that Rishi Sunak introduced, sort of allowing full expensing within the corporation tax system, which also, we both forecast and delivered some boosts to investment. I think the challenge with those kind of measures is that they can be very expensive because you're not only compensating new investment, but you end up just paying people for the investment that they're already doing. Businesses are getting tax breaks on investment that they are already doing if you write it off within the tax system. So trying to use the tax system to get more investment can just be very expensive. And one of the challenges that the Chancellor's faced in trying to use the tax system in that way is that, at least in his last budget, he couldn't afford to make it a permanent measure because of his commitments on his fiscal rules. And then finally, that covers workforce and investment. The last component of that is productivity. Sort of, can we get better at combining capital and labor in more productive ways? Some countries seem to be managing to pull this off. The US has got significantly higher productivity than we have had in the recent past. And they seem to be the sort of forefront of innovation and drawing and getting economic benefits out of that. And I think on that side, there's probably one reason to be optimistic and one reason to be pessimistic. I think my reason to be optimistic is AI might be the next big thing and be something which, for a given unit of labour, especially in a service-heavy economy like the UK, could make a lot of the workforce more productive at relatively low cost. I think the reason to be concerned, I think, is what's happening in global trade, which is that an awful lot of the productivity growth that's happened in the world over the last generation has come from the fact that you've got the gains from trade of just an integrating global economy, more and more comparative advantage being taken advantage of, and in effect more and more outsourcing of production to countries where it can be done the most efficiently. If the last decade or so is anything to go by, that process seems to be going into reverse, and a lot of the political dynamics also seem to be in favour of closing down economies rather than opening them up further, and that just makes it more difficult for any kind of innovation to be diffused around the world and taken advantage of where it can be most effectively. So there is some scope to make progress in all those areas, I think, but you know, whether one can manage to do it in a country like the UK is an open question.
Yeah, just to follow on for that, I mean, I think some of the traditional levers that we've relied on to get more money into the Treasury's coffers, they're just not there anymore. Take pensions, for example, raising the state pension aid. This government has decided to put off its next decision on where we're going to be at and how soon we're going to get there, because during COVID, life expectancy actually fell. So they want to, you know, more time to go away and do their homework. So that silver bullet isn't there. And if you read John Cridland's independent review on this is several years ago, before Baroness Neville-Rolfe's most latest review, he said, you know, even on a tube line, there's big disparities between life expectancy, you know, between stops, a couple of stations down. Some people are just not living long enough sometimes to claim the state pension if you want to raise it to something like 70 years old. And also some people who do manual jobs, how can you expect them to work into their late 60s, into their 70s? So, you know, as I said, that silver bullet just isn't there anymore. And the ONS said a couple of months ago, I think, that over the pandemic, the number of people living with 5 different conditions, so multiple morbidity, I think it climbed 40% between 2019 and 2023 to about 270,000. So there are a lot more people living with multiple health conditions, and that's something that policymakers do need to think about. I think just on Tom's point, I think one of the problems, and what Rob said, why are the issues still the same? It's because there's problems just getting stuff done here. You know, I think a lot of the premierships in this country, think of them, they're like running football clubs, they're like football managers. You need to get results now or you're out. And that isn't conducive to sort of a long-term plan for growth that is sustainable, I think. So, just for example, in terms of getting stuff done, let's look at scrapping the work capability assessment. So the government wants to make it easier for when people are out of work to assess whether they are fit for work, and they want to reform it so they look more at what people can do rather than what they can't. But the government's own white paper said, these policies haven't got a chance of bedding down until the end of the decade. So things take time, and in that time a lot of things change, as we've seen during the pandemic.
The danger is, I think we might come back in 10 years' time and still be discussing these issues because it's so dependent on politicians seizing the initiative. But maybe, given that constraint about being elected, then the consensus amongst economists needs to move, or we need to learn from best practice overseas. So suddenly it becomes less and less possible for politicians to resist where the change needs to come from. I tend to think, look, if we need to get economic growth up, Abe, when he was Prime Minister in Japan, had 3 arrows. And obviously Japan, very different to the UK. But you just look at Japan, social care. In the UK, speaking to friends a couple of months ago in trade unions who are very involved in this sector, they were telling me how people move jobs for 10p or 20p an hour. It's all low cost. You look at Japan, it's Japan Society 5.0. It's about investment, it's about the Internet of Things, it's about high quality social care. Ageing population, far more ageing already than Western economies, but they had gone down a very different route. But in terms of Abe's economic policies, the three arrows were one, macroeconomic policy, monetary policy sort of second arrow, fiscal policy, but the third arrow was the whole supply side agenda. And I feel that's where we need to focus our attention here. Richard touched on it, and it's all the I's. It's investment, it's innovation, it's infrastructure, and it's getting the incentives right. The challenge about the incentives is that higher taxes don't really work in terms of incentivising increased investment. If we look at best practice elsewhere, I was saying to Richard beforehand, since 2008, I tend to think the two economies in the West that really changed things were Silicon Valley, if I can call it in the economy, at the cutting edge of the whole AI technology space, and Ireland, where it's education and low corporate tax rates. Now, economists criticise the data in Ireland, but I was there recently, and I'm saying, my parents are Irish. I have so many relatives in Ireland, and basically the mood is so positive there. So there are best practice changes being done elsewhere. What should we do? Look, quick wins, get rid of fiscal rules, apart from debt to GDP coming down. No, you need someone to mark your homework. But actually, the OBR should be, in my view, doing more of the stress testing rather than politicians and the media, not that the media are all like this, tend to think, like last autumn, your fiscal numbers were so different to March. And suddenly we go from the media saying, oh, there's no room for manoeuvre, there's room for manoeuvre. They take this as an exact forecast, but maybe we can use that skill set to outline more the scenario planning and start to force choices. But basically, fiscal rules, apart from debt to GDP coming down, because you do need to keep the markets on side. You yourselves at the CPS have talked about planning reform to encourage more housing. 1 in 4 single firms, or was it sole traders in London when I worked at City Hall, were involved in the housing market. So housing has not that housing should drive an economy, but we know it has such a key aspect, and it addresses the issue facing many people under the age of 40 about lack of supply in terms of housing. So there are quick wins as well as long-term strategy.
Yeah, I mean, just worth saying, what would it take if you were going to grow the economy enough that you could afford, all of the promised welfare benefits and so on 50 years into the future? And the number is roughly 3% a year average growth for the next 50 years, which, it's not impossible. The US has had growth of roughly that magnitude since the Second World War, but of course it's a very different context. I think in 20 years' time, our workforce is going to start shrinking in absolute terms on current trends. So, and what are you sort of forecasting our long-run growth at sort of 1 to 1.5% if we're lucky at the moment? So there's an awful lot to do there. And that's why I said that although people use the rhetoric about prioritising growth, I don't think anyone has really scratched the surface of what it might mean. I mean, I do tax. There's a lot you could do on tax, in my view, that would make some difference. I think there's a lot you could do on regulation. Land use liberalisation, for me, is the absolute biggest one, because that's housing, but it's also commercial development, it's infrastructure, it's energy, it's agglomeration effects. That is, I think, the most profound constraint we have on growth in this country, our inability to build things. And again, that's one of these long-term problems that people have talked about for decades, and we're really no closer in practice to solving those problems now.
We had a CPS pamphlet on NIMBYism in 1990, which had lovely maps of how much more quickly the French built their motorways than us, and details of how many consultations you had to go through to build a dual carriageway in the UK, which I suspect that would be about 5 times more at the moment. I'm going to stop talking because we have some really good people in the room who might want to ask questions. So Vincent will come around with Mike. If we go to Phil and then Neil and the gentleman in the front row.
Thanks. Phil Aldrich at Bloomberg. Just a quick rejoinder on the ONS, the revisions that happened last week. Is that a positive sign for the public finances? We've had this, extra growth now. Does that mean that we should expect faster potential growth, which would potentially help fix the public finances? And just on the sort of a demographic time bomb disaster awaiting us. Japan, there were people were saying the same about Japan 30 years ago. They've got GDP per capita growing, even though they've got this aging population. It may not be such a disaster. It's bad for the fiscal position, but it may not be a disaster for the economy.
Well, Richard, on the
So on the ONS revisions, it tells us more about the past than it does about the future. In that the revisions were to 2021, and so for those who don't know, the ONS have revised where they thought the level of UK GDP reached as we emerged from the pandemic, and they've revised it up by about 1.5% of GDP. They've revised it up about 1.5%. Given that GDP fell in double digits, I mean, at the trough of the pandemic, you can give them some slack that figuring out exactly where it bounced back to is a challenging task. By looking at some of the micro data that underpins our GDP numbers, they come to the conclusion that it was around 1.5% higher as we emerged from the pandemic. It tells you what the level of GDP was at the end of the pandemic. It tells you less about the dynamics of the economy coming out of that, and clearly a lot has happened since the pandemic, including an energy crisis, which is and rising interest rates and rising inflation, which are some of the key things driving the dynamics going forward. So, and what we don't know is what are their revisions to future years. So, I think for the moment, it's certainly relevant to helping us better understand our experience of the pandemic, and it looks as though we're less of an outlier than we might have thought. It also helps to solve a few puzzles, which is it looked like the tax take was very high coming out of the pandemic, and obviously because you revise up GDP, this revises down things like the tax burden. And other ratios, so it helps to solve some of the puzzles that we had as we emerged from the pandemic. But because it's a revision to the level of GDP and not to its dynamics thereafter, it doesn't tell you as much as you might think about the future.
And Japanification, if anyone wants to come in on that.
Yeah, Japan is interesting. I think there is a big difference, though, between Japan and the UK, coming back to Phil's question. Japan has high domestic savings and has a current account surplus. The UK does not. And indeed, Richard's, one of his opening comments was about how dependent, not they use that word, but how dependent we are on foreigners to buy a section of our debt. And indeed, it comes back to this whole debate about where the public finances should be. I remember soon after I joined the city, the Lawson boom was going strong. And I argued that the Lawson boom was going to become a bust because we were focusing on the budget surplus as the best guide to the overall health of the UK economy. And at the time, we were ignoring the fact that the private sector liabilities were going through the roof against the background of a credit boom. And public plus private equals overseas. In simple terms, we had a current account or trade deficit, became a current account deficit, which showed that the UK was having to depend on overseas money coming in. Wasn't the problem then, but it's continued since. So we now, the important thing is we can't just look at the public sector finances, private sector balance sheet. Pretty important. And in Japan, there is a difference. Of course, the positive for the UK at the moment is the Japanese are investing heavily overseas. We should be seeking to attract a lot more of that Japanese investment into the UK. But there is a difference between Japan and the UK.
And I think the only thing I wanted to add was that I really don't mean to suggest that everything is hopeless and that there's nothing we can do and we're completely doomed. And it may have come across that way, and if so, I apologise, because in fact, I mean, despair leads to inertia. And you know, I think that's probably one of the problems. People look at these figures and they think, oh, we can't do anything about that. Let's just hope something comes along and changes things. And maybe something will come along. Maybe AI revolutionises the economy. You know, maybe these anti-obesity drugs mean that people live longer, healthier lives without all these comorbidities, and healthcare becomes more affordable. You know, there are external changes that could happen, and equally, you know, Adam Smith said there's a great deal of ruin in a nation, and people are amazing, and we can invent things, and you know, we can still progress, even if the overall picture looks bad. But I think what we do need to do is face up to the brutal realities of what could happen and what is likely to happen on the current path, and actually start thinking about the big long-term things that would have to change to avoid that outcome. And those are big long-term things which are really outside the normal bounds of political debate and policy discussion. But someone has to be thinking about those and talking about those.
Either taxes have to rise by an amount we haven't seen before, or the state has to stop doing things, or growth has to go up, or we have to, or planning has to. Something has to change.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Neil, sorry.
Neil Collins. Those of us who are unfortunate enough to have time to listen to the radio, particularly the voice of doom at Radio 4, the solution to every single problem seems to be more government spending in one form or another. And I think this is not because just the mindset of the people at Radio 4. I think this reflects the view of the majority of people. Economics is a dismal science, and we're all economists to one degree or another. But most people, in my view, just seem to think that the solution is more intervention by the government, more government spending, more of the sort of things that we'd like to have, without any understanding of where the wealth generation is going to come from. Now, I'm not expecting people to be experts, but I do expect the media to behave rather better than they do. But at the moment, I do think that particularly the broadcast media are part of the problem. What do you suggest, dear panel, to try and change this grim, restrictive mindset?
Forbidden from.
Probably am. Although I think it's fair to say the government's not disabusing them of that notion, right? That we've had two big shocks to the UK economy, and both of them, the largest fiscal consequence was not so much the foregone tax receipts, but the additional spending that the government did during the pandemic and then during the energy crisis. So, there is this, when we do our own estimates of kind of what is the cost of a typical shock to the UK economy, we've had to increase that in recent years because it used to be that you had a standard recession, tax receipts went down, and that was the main source of the pressure on the public finances from a shock. Now you have to factor in the fact that increasingly as shocks arise, governments provide quite a lot of proactive discretionary compensation to households to help them through it. Now, some of that helps preserve productive potential and keeps the economy going, as the furlough scheme did during the pandemic. But also, the government's created two new bits of the welfare state in the last 5 years, right? The CJRS, and then more recently the energy price guarantee. And these were things which nobody even imagined in 2019.
And our colleague Dylan did a report on the energy price cap, and I said surely the best argument against the energy price cap is the government's shown that if prices get too high, it'll just intervene anyway. So why do you need it? Anyway, Sue, did you have any?
Perhaps I should just apologise if the criticism is directed towards me. But I do agree in some sense that we had the furlough scheme, the energy price cap, and then the automatic question was, what are you going to do to help people with their mortgages? And is it the government's problem to help people with their mortgages? Surely it should be, as a responsible borrower, you should be thinking about, whether you can afford something before you can take it out. So there has been a mindset of, the state intervention, the state stepping in, that we need to step back from. And also in terms of public sector workers, we heard a report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies that suggests that Rishi Sunak's workforce plan for the NHS, it's going to cost tens of billions of pounds more to hire, I think, in a few years' time, by the end of the decade, I think 1 in 9 workers will be, or 1 in 11 workers, or certainly almost 1 in 10 will be working for the NHS. And that is alarming. I still think, at some levels of, at the civil service, I think civil service pay and constraint has been in the news a lot. And I think it is still important to attract the right talent. I mean, I was looking at some jobs in the civil service at director level, and you could get a deputy director job for £60,000, and you have to ask yourself, is that the right level to attract talent? But at the same time, does the civil service, does the public sector need that many people, or can it be more efficient? And it can definitely be more efficient, and it's not just the NHS, it's other areas like the justice system. I think there does need to be wholesale reform and more efficiency in the public sector overall.
So, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for a very insightful and comprehensive presentation. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about the possibility of UK GAFA. And so you have very good universities and venture universities and unicorns and decacorns. And then private equity could buy everything, and no listed company like GAFA in this country. And now Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt provided the idea of mansion house compact, and pension fund money is going to early stage of companies. Do you think will it work or not?
Whoever wants to, don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start with that anyway. I mean, I think that you've alighted upon some of the strengths, potential strengths of the UK there. You know, world-leading universities, startups, unicorns, and so on. Incredible financial industry, potentially very large pools of capital, and maybe there's a sense that things just aren't quite connected the way they could be and should be. And if that changed, then maybe our economic performance would be better. I think that that's all true, and I sort of welcome a lot of the reforms that they're making. I'm also, you always joke about this, Rob, but the amount of times we've heard just getting some money out of UK pension funds could solve this problem over the last 5 years.
My joke is if I had 10 quid for every time I've heard that, or a panel or a round table, I would have a pension.
You could buy a startup. Yeah. And so I think, you know, we shouldn't think of a silver bullet there, but there's certainly a lot that can be explored and improved upon.
Yeah, well, the last question very much follows on from the previous question in some respects. Yeah, we've got more universities in the top 100 than the rest of Western Europe put together. So one of the themes, apart from pension funds investing, has been leveraging off the ideas of universities. But that's been an ongoing issue for some time. But there has been a lot more done in the last few years to incentivise more private money to go into universities, to encourage, to invest in those ideas. Look, the public sector, I would say, has a role to play, but it's not about the public sector doing everything. I think it's also about the public sector, in terms of Whitehall, Westminster, incentivising, putting the right levers for the private sector to do more. That includes tax policy. John Fridland was mentioned earlier. He used to be the head of the CBI. And at that time, he always used to talk about the problem being small and medium-sized companies in the UK. And I think that is a challenge, that we have too much policy influence dictated by big corporations. Not that we shouldn't take on board what they say, but we should be asking how we can encourage small and medium-sized firms to do more. Pension funds, I agree with the previous point. It's always given as the easy option. Pension funds, when you speak to them, they always talk about their fiduciary responsibility, but they haven't seized the opportunity when you look at some of the areas in London where Canadian and Australian pension funds have seized the opportunity. So there might be some in it, but I think, again, it's not the panacea, it's not the only thing. The idea that you group them all together also isn't necessarily an easy guarantee to see more investment. But it might help, but at the margin.
Probably have time for one more round of, oh God. Okay, let's try and get these very quickly. Dylan at the back, Keith at the front, and then the lady there.
I was very glad to hear you talk about obesity, because the real problem is not aging, it's incapacity and the need to be looked after. And that's actually partly related to the present problems we've got, because although the unemployment is very low, those who are in disability is actually very high, much higher than it should be. And if one's really going to hope for improvements in future years, nobody's talked about medical science. And the real problem is that we've been very successful in dealing with cardiovascular and cancer. But we've had until now, we've had virtually no improvements at all in dealing with the neurological ailments of the old, dementia and Parkinson's. And if there's one real hope that these fiscal problems could disappear, it would be if medical science could lead to these neurological problems being overtaken.
Could we actually just take all the questions together just to speed things through? Because, yeah, and then I'll make sure each one is answered.
Hi, Lucy White from Bloomberg. Tom, you mentioned the need for welfare state reform, and you mentioned the sort of political impossibility of this at the moment. You say that, you know, in perhaps 50 years' time, you know, you can recognise the need for some change, but right now, no one's willing to address it. If that's not willing to be addressed now, given the years that we've had, what kind of impetus can you see for that ever actually being addressed? What's going to make it change?
My name's Keith Boyfield. I hope this is on. I'm not really a betting man, but I'd like to ask the panel what odds they would quote me for James Forsyth as he sits down over the next month with Richie Sunak to write the Tory party leaders conference. What odds would you quote me on them going in for a review of the misnamed green belt, which isn't particularly green? So what are your odds?
Anyone want to go for any of those? I could start by saying 0%. Like literally 0%.
Yeah, I can do a sort of quick fire on that. Keith, I'm so much not a betting man that I'm not even sure how to state the odds for you, but I think the odds are very low, certainly pre-election. But it's something we're working on at the Centre for Policy Studies, so maybe longer term, there will be more support for those kind of arguments and those kind of reviews coming. Oh, wow, there we are.
Although they've just fired the person who was looking at the green belt. So.
I think on the hopes for advances in healthcare, particularly on neurological issues and also obesity, as you mentioned, of course that is the huge hope. And I have heard, you know, very inspiring speeches about, you know, the potential to slow and reverse the aging process and deal with some of these problems and the way that science may advance in that direction. So we just hope that that happens. I think there's always not a danger, because it's a welcome thing, any kind of healthcare advance. But in the past, often advances in healthcare technology have actually led to rising costs because it simply increases the range of conditions that can be treated and keeps people going for longer with those conditions. But let's hope that changes. I'm completely with you on that. Left the hardest question to last, obviously. What would have to happen for people to start taking these questions of long-term fiscal costs and reform of the welfare state more seriously? For me, there was a real kind of symbolic moment under a recent government where they were trying to address the issues around social care. And for as long as I've been involved in policy, whenever a government, and whether it was Labour or Conservative, was talking about reforming an area of public service, they would reach into the sort of market-based reform toolkit, and they think about how can the private sector do more, how can we have competition, how can we have choice. And almost for the first time, in this case, they said, well, we need to raise taxes and spend more money. And I think that points to a real deterioration in political and policy thinking, and perhaps a lack of imagination, perhaps being led too much by the opinion polls. This is not really an answer to your question, it's further waffle around it. But I think basically the narratives that I've been espousing, and maybe the sunnier version of them, have to actually cut through. People need to face the facts, but also I think people have to understand, realise and believe that things could be different. It's very, very difficult for people to imagine a healthcare system operating in a radically different fashion when they've never heard of a healthcare system operating in a radically different fashion. And so I think there's work there to be done, sort of imagining it, designing it, maybe looking at examples around the world that you can learn from, maybe looking back to history about things that have happened in the past. But basically it's a huge intellectual battle that has to happen.
Okay. I suppose, if I could take them in reverse order. On Greenbelt, I think that I'm always nervous when economists always agree on something because it implies it's bound to be wrong often. But economists are in agreement about the Greenbelt. But the issue here really is about sequencing. The idea if you suddenly allow housing to be built on the Greenbelt, it doesn't necessarily solve all the issues. The sequencing is that you need to have the right infrastructure in place. Say, for instance, the Treasury, when they did their cost-benefit analysis before the Green Book came into effect, said the Docklands and Canary Wharf would be a failure. Obviously, it was a success, but it became a success after the infrastructure was put in place first. So as long as the sequencing is right, then you get the right outcomes. Otherwise, you'll start to get all sorts of problems. The second thing, Lucy's question about voting, I remember attending a dinner in the part of the century in Singapore where this was the debate, and the proposal, it was about 8, 9, 10 people there, was whether you could have partial votes. I didn't think it would work, but it was interesting. The idea was that you build in legacy problems where as people get older, they vote the way they get the benefits. So the argument was whether people who are working should have a vote.
Like the French tax system, where if you have children, you get basically an extra you get an extra half share per child off your tax bill. Maybe
But the idea was incentives. But obviously, there's challenges with that. I wouldn't necessarily go down that route. But I don't think people necessarily vote only in a selfish way. It reinforces the need to get the narrative right and to make people think about what's best for the country longer term. And the third point, I agree with the point about what the demographics is a dividend of disaster, but the importance of technology, as Tom's touched on, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Sue and Richard, and also sort of any final remarks as we go.
Greenbelt, again, I think also no chance. Just on the idea of disability, I think there is one of the most striking stats in your latest economic and fiscal outlook, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, is it's either 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 people of working age will be on some sort of disability benefit by 2028, which I think is striking. And it's not just, physical health, it is mental health, and not just neurological diseases, as you point out, but also mental health among young people. And if you talk to insiders at DWP, they recognise this is an issue. 2.5 million people not even looking for a job because for health reasons. But they think it's a challenge because, you have to get health professionals to, help tackle this. And training them is not like, when my first job was on the shop floor, it's not just hiring loads of people on the shop floor. These people need training. You need to place them in the right places. And there are pilot programs such as, I think it's called Working Well in Manchester that DWP have rolled out to try to give people more tailored support to get them into a job, and not only do that, to keep them there. But that costs money, it takes time, it takes resource, it needs people to be trained up. We've got a labour shortage, so these problems they're going to be with us for a while, I think. And I agree, British population is a lot sicker than it was, before the pandemic even, and it's a major structural challenge.
I'm definitely not going to make any promises about or forecasts about the green belts because I get in enough trouble making forecasts about the economy. But on
although the green belt and the economy are intrinsically linked.
No doubt. I think obesity is definitely an issue, and I think it's one of the things which one of the factors that has been driving sort of rising rates of inactivity amongst people who are of working age and maybe in the past might have been in the workforce. The other one, as Sue pointed out, is mental health. And so, and on the one hand, you could say, well, that's just a counsel of despair because we've seen obesity rates rise and rise in the population. And once you reach a certain level of obesity, you start to have multiple health complications and it makes it harder and harder to work. I think the reason to be optimistic is that one of the biggest revolutions in public health and has had knock-on benefits for the economy has been the decline in smoking that happened since the war. And that was one thing that was allowing a lot more people to live longer, work longer, have longer productive lives, more rewarding lives, and ultimately lives that were also less expensive for these public finance dilemmas that we've talked about. And that was a big behavioural change. It took a very long time, but it did change. And it was one of the things which has been a sort of bright spot in all the sort of public health data that we've seen. So societies can change these things. It does take time. It takes, and there's always a handful of people who are still out there engaged in behaviours that are not good for themselves. But these things can change and they can have very big consequences.
And you're not going to be drawn on welfare. How long can this go on for on welfare state reform? Or what will it take to?
I mean, the one thing I would say, there have been a series of quite big changes in the welfare state in the last few years. Some that are expensive, the furlough scheme, the energy price guarantee, those are massive things which you would have put on par with beverage had they existed in 1945. But you've also seen some pretty big changes in the last year in the form of extensions of childcare support for people with young children. So you can those are all reforms of the welfare state in ways in which make it more generous.
I was going to say.
But there are also discussions at least ongoing about ways in which to try and make it more affordable.
On which sort of encouraging note. Thank you all so much. I know there were lots more people who wanted to ask questions. Hopefully some of our panel will stick around unless we're going to be kicked out to answer them. But thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you so much to our panel.
Thank you.